a disclaimer, this is not to attack Christianity, but to show chronology as to the origins of the religion, to how it got to South Africa and how we ended up as a Christian society and how that has affected us as a Black people and how we are managing and coping with that in modern times.
Welcome to an all-new episode of Looks and Wisdom Sundays with me, Oluchi B.
Hey guys, and welcome to another exciting episode of Looks and Wisdom Sundays with me, Oluchi B, aka the Elusive Pundit. Honey, how are you feeling? How's everybody feeling at the back?
We're good. How are you?
I thought I was alone in the studio. I was like, where's everybody? So April is a holy month for Christians across the globe. And I decided to focus the topics for Looks and Wisdom in and around Christianity. And I was looking for topics that were not discussed before. And as a South African and as a Black South African and as a person who has grown up in a Christianity household surrounded by Christians, I decided that it was very important for us to look at Christianity and the role that it has played for Black people in South Africa throughout the ages. So today's essay is going to be titled, Is Christianity Slavery? So a disclaimer, this is not to attack Christianity, but to show chronology as to the origins of the religion, to how it got to South Africa and how we ended up as a Christian society and how that has affected us as a Black people and how we are managing and coping with that in modern times. This essay is going to be long, so I suggest you get some popcorn, some wine, some water, some snacks, sit down and enjoy this. And for me, the intention behind creating this essay is to show people that things are not isolated and we are not a despondent people, and we can always move forward and correct as we move forward. I have decided to break down this essay into multiple parts. Firstly, we're going to be looking at the history of religion, and then we're going to be looking at the history of Christianity, and then we're going to be looking at how Christianity came into South Africa, the Southern African region, as well as how it coming to the Southern African region, which we know is South Africa today, actually affected and continues to affect the Black people in the country. So what is religion? Because you know, over here at Looks and Wisdom, we love a good definition. Religion at its core is a system of beliefs and practices relating to the supernatural, often involving a belief in a deity or deities. It encompasses a wide range of social, cultural systems, including behaviors, practices, morals, and worldviews, and often addresses human existence and the nature of the world. So that's the modern definition of religion. And in modern times, we currently have 5 main religions, Christianity being the number 1 overall religion in the world. And then, having looked at the modern definition of religion, we have to look at the old definition of religion. And in order for me to do this, I have broken this down into the Middle Ages, the pre-Middle Ages, and the post-Middle Ages. So the pre-Middle Ages, and this is based on the European history. Religion comes from the Latin word religio. And what this word loosely translates to is having moral integrity. It also approximates to conscientiousness, devotedness, and felt obligation. And these were done unrelated to specific gods. So they didn't have a Christianity. And then obviously people started moving towards each other as we move into the Middle Ages. And so what happened by the Middle Ages is the fact that a group of people started connecting together around having the same beliefs. And when these people started forming around each other, having the same beliefs, they started doing things called vows, where they would come together and be like, we vow as this group to do this and to do that. And this is how Christianity started to form bit by bit in the Middle Ages, where people started grouping each other and forming the early stages of Christianity as a religion. And then after the Middle Ages, we actually do find that Christianity has now organized. You remember those group of people that were forming vows and grouping together? They started forming a formal religion. And what this means is that religion started moving from being an religio, the Latin word, which was an individual's relationship with a deity, to now being a group context. And then that's when religion started moving into a social genus. And what a social genus means is that it moved away from being a separate thing that people do separately and started forming as a social context. So this is a group of people that see Christianity as their way of life through having it as a socialization. That's when you started having people identify as Christians, and then you have others that started identifying as non-Christians. And now you might want to ask yourself, as the Europeans were organizing themselves into a religion that is called Christianity, what were the Africans doing at the time? So around the Middle Ages, South Africa actually hadn't existed as a country, or even Southern Africa hadn't existed as a country. So what was happening around the time was that South Africa was still filled with the San and the Khoi people, and the Bantu migration was at its infancy. And then we move post the Middle Ages, post the Roman Empire, into the 1600s. The concept of religion has moved from being a social genus into a cultural identity. And the Europeans already at the time have understood that they can actually use religion to move into the different spheres of the world.
And by this we mean the West has figured out a way to colonize other cultures through religious slavery.
Let's look at South Africa and its own history with Christianity. As everybody knows, Jan van Riebeeck arrived in South Africa in 1664 on the Dromedaris, darling. So the Dutch people come in, they have their own church, the Dutch Reformed Church. So that was the original Christianity church that arrived in South Africa around the 1600s. There isn't any literature around whether or not in those early stages the Khoi and the San people actually merged with the Dutch Reformed Church at the time. So I'm not going to look at the church from that time. 1664, Jan van Riebeeck come in. And then after that, the British also came in. So we had two foreign colonizers in South Africa at the time, the Dutch and the English. And so what happened is that they started having their own problems. And then the Dutch people started moving up, and then the British people started moving up. And by moving up, we mean they started moving into the Eastern Cape. And then there were Xhosa people in the Eastern Cape, and then they did this through something called the Grand Plan.
And this grand plan design included displacing Xhosa people from their lands, taking over their territory, as well as taking over their livestock, leaving them displaced.
So rule number one of colonization was the Grand Plan, which is how the colonizers moved in and started taking up land that belonged to the indigenous people. The indigenous people actually started to lose their socio-economical standing. It meant that then they started having to work for the colonizers that were in the country.
Which is exactly what the British wanted, to have the native people as their servants. And then this was done across the country with the different indigenous groups.
Up until the 1800s, which we saw the Voortrekker and the British people move into the Transvaal. And what happened when they moved into the Transvaal after destabilizing all the indigenous group on the way is that they actually found the diamonds and the gold mines in Johannesburg and in Kimberley. And that changed the whole narrative for South Africa and its people.
I wanted to add that the gold rush forced South Africa into a rapid urbanization. So that meant a lot of the indigenous people that were still in the indigenous cities had to move into the mainland, closer to the town where mining was taking place. And a lot of them moved with their families, and some of them were separated from their families. And then this is when we start seeing black people in urban places. This meant that the British Empire had a lot of natives under their control, in which they could do whatever they wanted to do.
Then they have to move into plan B, which is okay, now we have destabilized these people. They no longer have a place and a home. They are now working for us in our places, in our minds, in all of these economical hubs that we've created. How do we further make sure that they are docile and accepting of the white supreme order? Then enters the church. So, in order for you to understand what comes next for the Black South African, we have to look at the bigger scheme of things in terms of the role of Christianity in slavery. I'm not going to go into it. I think everybody's seen 12 Years a Slave. So, one of the key things that happened in the 1800s was that slavery was actually formally abolished. But one of the things that was not formally abolished was the learnings from how to use Christianity in order to enslave a people for the gain of the colonial powers. And they did this through the missionaries and the missionary churches. And I'm going to be showing the story of the colonization of the Black mind via the missionaries with the story of the Tswana people. This is an article that I read which speaks about how Africans were marginalized out of their own cultural and social identity in order to assimilate with the white God that was brought about by the missionaries. And this is an excerpt for what the missionaries thought about the indigenous people at the time.
So basically, this is how the missionaries saw the indigenous people as indifferent, stupid, ignorant, and ignorant to the divine order.
I'm going to look at a different context that's written by different people around what was happening at the same time with the Tswana people.
Well, it says here that Botswana indigenous people possessed a rich cultural and religious tradition, and that they did have a supreme being in the form of Modimo, which is far removed from what the missionaries were saying previously.
So this basically already tells you that there was a strong disparity regarding the missionaries and what they understood about the indigenous people. You can see that instead of them understanding or trying to understand the culture of the local people, they actually seeked for the indigenous people to forego their own cultural practices, their own religious practices in favor of the missionary God. And you might ask, how did they do this?
And for this purpose, we will use the story of the Botswana people. The aim was to have Botswana children grow up being ignorant to their African identity and then becoming Europeanized in their ways of thinking, thus softening their hearts to embrace the European colonial takeover from a very young age. The missionaries targeted the rulers for conversion, hoping that once the chiefs were converted, their subjects would follow suit, thus preparing the ground for the colonial government. The missionaries are also alleged to have used the Bible as a tool to colonize the minds of Africans. Through the Bible, they psychologically made Botswana humble and passive, thus making encroachment of the colonizers easy and acceptable. The missionaries also used the Bible to seriously weaken the traditional culture and describing it as evil.
And then that's how they started to move into the cultural and the societal places in these indigenous societies. A lot of the people were actually converted to Christianity. And this Christianity was the same Christianity that we see in the slavery movies, where the Black people had to work as servants to the white people, and the white people deemed themselves to be masters of the servants. So the Black people's introduction to religion has always been white supremacy and Black servitude, whichever way you look at it. So moving into the 1900s, the churches around Black people started evolving, and then they included African spirituality. The ZCC Church is one of the main examples around this. And what this meant was that Black people were moving further and further away from their original essence and their original culture as a people, and moving into Christianity and putting some of the African elements into Christianity. But then Christianity was still the main goal and was still being used to indoctrinate Black people into being docile and into agreeing with the status quo of the time. Apartheid actually came in the 1940s.
Our policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily, and perhaps much better, be described as a policy of good neighborliness, accepting that there are differences between people. But while these differences exist, and you have to acknowledge them, at the same time, you can live together, aid one another, but that it can best be done when you act as good neighbors always do.
So what happened after South Africa got into apartheid was that the Dutch Reformed Church went back into prominence, and the missionaries worked in the background. This is around government and policy, because in the British era, the government and policy were being perpetuated through the missionaries that were part of the British rule. And then when apartheid came in, it was back to the Dutch Reformed Church. Black people were still continuing with their own way of churching. And apartheid brought about an extreme division amongst the races. With the apartheid, there was like a strong distinction and a strong separation between white and Black again. The colonizers, which was the apartheid government at this time, did not necessarily have to use Christianity as a tool of oppression, because it was already a tool of oppression. So what was Christianity through the Dutch Reformed Church doing?
The Dutch Reformed Church supported apartheid through theological justifications, establishing segregated churches and supporting apartheid policies, which further marginalized the Black people.
And then in 1968, the Dutch Reformed Church was actually called out by the Global Society of Churches for its role in apartheid.
It would take more than 10 years for the Dutch Reformed Church to be formally expelled by the Church Society for the active role that it played in apartheid and the oppression of Black people.
And it went away. But did it go away? We don't know. But what we do know is that around the same time, the right-wing churches from America were actually also supporting apartheid and the apartheid government through broadcast and through having the right-wing evangelist bishops actually come to South Africa. Now we're in 1968, so the Dutch Reformed Church has been expelled, but you guys know that they're working in the background, allegedly. But then the right wing then comes into prominence. Around the 1970s, the Black consciousness movement was getting into prominence with guys like Steve Biko.
Why the Black consciousness movement, you may ask? Here is a passage to explain. By the 1970s, all in all, the Black person had become a shell, a shadow of the man, completely defeated, drowned in his own misery, a slave, an ox bearing the yoke of oppression with sheepish timidity. In response, the Black consciousness movement helped the Black people to find their identity in themselves.
And also with that came in Black theology. And what the Black theologists were doing around the 1970s is that they were trying to reason with the white supremacy churches.
Black theology is a theology that gave to Black South Africans human dignity and a Black identity. Black theology in South Africa confronted the imbalances of power and the abuse of power by the structures. The Bible narrative of the Exodus was used as justification.
So these were Black people using the Bible to state their claim that if God is saying we're all equal, why are you guys saying we're not equal? But it was going to be another close to 20 years before we saw an actual change. So 1970s, 1980s, the Black resistance was getting stronger against the apartheid government. Some of the Christian people that would now have been Christians for more than 50 years, 60 years, actually came to the realization that they can use Christianity to their advantage to gain some traction for the support of the anti-apartheid government. And that came into a close in 1989, where we actually get the Dutch Reformed Church to denounce apartheid. And you might ask yourself, why 1989? So in 1989, a lot was happening. The discussions around releasing Nelson Mandela were actually underway. There was a lot of traction around the world regarding releasing South Africa from apartheid government. South Africa was the only African country at the time to not be released from colonization via apartheid. The apartheid government was like, okay, we're looking at ways to transition into a democracy. And the Dutch Reformed Church were the first ones to be like, oh, we don't like apartheid. And this is not a coincidence. This has been getting discussed in the 1980s as the white people were seeing that apartheid was not working, not necessarily because they like Black people, but more because financially it wasn't working. It was going to be a better state if Black people were actually immersed into the economy. Then comes 1990 when Nelson Mandela was free.
Friends, comrades, and fellow South Africans, I greet you all in the name of peace, democracy, and freedom for all. I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people. Your tireless and heroic sacrifices have made it possible for me to be here today. I therefore place the remaining years of my life in your hands.
Around this time, there was a lot of turmoil with the CODESA negotiations between 1990 and 1994.
The second leg of the Convention for Democratic South Africa, or CODESA 2, came to a halt on the 16th of May 1992, when negotiating parties failed to reach an agreement on an interim government and the Constitution. The National Party came to an agreement with the African National Congress's calls for an interim government, but the intricacies of the government put the two at loggerheads. While the government proposed for a longer period of shared power and for aspects of a new constitution to be settled, subject to change only by the 75% majority, the ANC rejected this, insisting that a popularly elected Constituent Assembly make that decision. The tension and breakdown of the talks was further intensified by the Boipatong massacre in June that year, bringing an abrupt end to the talks. On the night of the 17th of June 1992, over 50 people were killed in Boipatong, a township near Vanderbijl Park in Gauteng. The massacre was the culmination of ongoing political violence in the area, which rocked the township and put a halt to political negotiation as the African National Congress members blamed the National Party for the attacks. Many of the victims were women and children caught in the crossfire of political violence.
A lot of the parties were actually not coming into the party.
The Boipatong massacre, and then the commitment to restart negotiations after the Bishu massacre, and finally all the issues that were threatening to unravel and result in civil war in South Africa came together, agreement was reached. We even had the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging storming this area. There was an invasion by right-wingers just days after the decision had been reached to have elections on the 27th of April 1994. And despite all that disruption and so much that could have derailed these talks over and over again, this is where it all came together and the democratic process was sealed. It's remarkable.
So the CODESA agreed on the land, the economy, and the resources.
The threat of the country descending into chaos at last receded. In Carter, the election's last formidable opponent would participate. To add them to the ballot paper, 80 million stickers had to be printed. More than 19 million people voted. The ANC won 63%, the National Party 20%.
I was able to see Ruth Mayer for the first time dancing on the floor where we were having this party. He was quite happy, he was quite jovial. And I kept wondering whether I would have been as happy as he was if I was in his position, having finally given in the way that they had.
Key National Party negotiators were satisfied they had struck a workable deal with an adversary they had grown to trust.
Oh my God. President Ramaphosa, oh my God. So it's kind of fascinated why these white supremacists were actually happy with the negotiations. That man, obviously they were happy. They had all the land, all the wealth, everything. The only thing that black people had was they could get a good education.
And then, come 1994, Nelson Mandela becomes the president of South Africa as the first black president.
Both Nelson Mandela and South Africa had traveled a long way to get to this moment. More than 300 years of white domination ended for good with the swearing in of Nelson Mandela as this African nation's first black president.
So help me God.
He was the most famous opponent of the brutal racist system of apartheid, imprisoned 27 years. Today, Mandela paid tribute to his new vice president, F.W. de Klerk, the last apartheid president who negotiated the historic transfer of power. Mandela then called for unity in this racially diverse and racially divided land.
The time for the healing of the wounds has come. The moment to bridge the chasms that divides us has come. The time to build is upon us.
This was something few people ever had expected to see, a peaceful transition after years of bloody racial strife. Hundreds of dignitaries from around the world came to witness history, to see the South African military, which once had enforced apartheid, fly overhead in tribute to Nelson Mandela, trailing the colors of the new South African flag.
And what did this mean? It meant people were now free, but how do you contain free people from going AWOL with the freedom? You bring the church. We are now in the new era. So what the government is trying to do is to have this transition from apartheid into democracy. And what they are trying to do is to make sure that this is happening as smoothly as possible. The last time we heard about the church and its footprints in politics was in 1989, when the Dutch Reformed Church said that they were not birthday denouncing apartheid.
After the fall of apartheid in 1994, Nelson Mandela led South Africa through a difficult transition, promoting forgiveness and healing rather than revenge. He established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, in 1996, under the leadership of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, to address the atrocities committed during apartheid. The TRC was groundbreaking because it allowed victims to speak out about the injustices they faced, while perpetrators who confessed were granted amnesty. The TRC helped prevent large-scale retribution and facilitated national healing.
There isn't much information available on actually the churches congressing and discussing this, but what we do know is the output of it. We do know this because Archbishop Desmond Tutu was the face of this transition.
When we arrived at Kulenburg, do you remember you hung me up?
I may have done it, sir.
To listen to the victims of human rights abuses, to provide reparation, and to grant amnesty. These were the three main tasks of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The scope of the commission dated from the 1960s right through to 1994, including the Shell House massacre, the murder of Communist Party leader Chris Hani, and the St. James Church attack in Cape Town. While many wanted answers around high-profile killings and disappearances, it was the everyday brutality of the apartheid system that came to characterize much of the hearings. For some, it was all too much. The perpetrators also had to be heard. In planning the commission, some had argued for a punitive system like the Nuremberg trials, which prosecuted Nazi war criminals. But in the end, the TRC chose a more conciliatory approach. Applicants had to prove their acts were politically motivated and make a full disclosure to receive clemency. Shocking scenes of torture were reenacted for the commission. ANC bomber Robert McBride and former police hit squad commander Dirk Coetzee were both granted amnesty. Chris Hani's killers, Janus Vallus and Clive Derby-Lewis, were not. But many chose not to apply for amnesty, among them high-ranking former government officials. Apartheid-era chemical warfare expert Dr. Wouter Basson was one of them. He later went to trial, but the state found insufficient evidence to convict him. The commission formally ended in 2001. Of the more than 7,000 amnesty applications, less than 1,000 were granted. And the matter of reparations continues to be a bone of contention for many victims. While not perfect, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been used as a model by other countries seeking reconciliation.
There's a lot of debate around the TRC and its legacy. Let's look at some of these. Some argue that because the TRC focused on forgiveness and reconciliation, it ignored some of the bigger issues that were happening in and around South Africa at the time. The TRC's biggest failure is that it failed to address the more collective loss of dignity, opportunities, and systematic violence experienced by the oppressed. The church's role in making black South Africans docile post-apartheid is a complex issue with varying perspectives. While some argue that churches, particularly after the end of apartheid, focus on reconciliation and peace building, which could have been seen as a form of pacification. This was emphasized through the TRC's structure of emphasis on reconciliation and peace. The Rainbow Nation was the promise of democracy, and this was a term coined by Desmond Tutu to describe the post-apartheid South Africa. The term was used by Nelson Mandela in his first month in the office. The term was intended to describe the multiculturalism and the coming together of a people from different nations and from different creeds. And this term was actually inspired by Christianity and the story of Noah and the flood in the Bible, as God made a covenant with the rainbow people of God. This is how Nelson Mandela described the Rainbow Nation. We enter into a covenant that we shall build a society in which all South Africans, both black and white, will be able to walk tall without any fear in their hearts, assured of their inalienable right to human dignity, a rainbow nation where peace prevails.
So what the TRC did is that it really focused on pacifying South Africans as we know them today. And what do we mean by this is the fact that South Africa comes from oppressing Black people for more than 400 years now, since the 1600s, since Jan van Riebeeck first came in. Black people have been marginalized out of their self-identity, out of their cultural identity, out of their direct relationship with God and their gods that they had before, out of their economy, out of their land, out of their resources, out of everything, to a point where they had to be servants to the white supremacists that were in the country. Sharpeville massacre, the uprising in Soweto, if you read the apartheid era literature around Black people being beaten, killed, everything that you can think of exists. Anything that you have seen in a horror movie, you have seen it. So you are taking traumatized Black people and you are saying to them, forgive, forget, let's move on, let's not have any consequences for the perpetrators, which were the white people. So that's what the TRC via the Rainbow Nation actually did for South Africa, was to pacify Black South Africans.
And the churches played an active role in this. Here's how. This article speaks about the church's direct influence into the TRC, as well as the TRC policies that were made and then perpetuated via the TRC Commission. And also it speaks directly to the churches actively preaching the message of reconciliation into their churches directly. And it speaks about how without the church, the impact of the TRC would be different. And now that we have looked at the church's role via the TRC and Rainbow Nation, let's see how the Rainbow Nation is doing today. This article is from the Nelson Mandela Foundation. We are now fully into 30 years of democracy, and yet South Africa still grapples with its legacy, which includes unequal education, unequal pay, segregated communities, and massive economic disparities. Much of it is reinforced by existing institutions and attitudes against a backdrop of colonialism and apartheid. So with the TRC having concluded and South Africa swiftly moving into the Rainbow Nation, a lot of the South Africans still subscribe to Christianity and is a part of their identity. But now churches have evolved and there is a new search for Black identity. And now we will be looking at the current churches in the present day and how they are affecting this. I wanted to add a disclaimer that I will only be looking at Black churches that are led by Black leaders. Next week, I'm speaking to Bonjo on multiracial churches.
How I wanted to end this segment and this essay was,
by this time, a lot of South Africans were fully fledged into Christian culture, and they used it as a means of salvation and a means of pacification. So to remedy the trauma that they have experienced, they went to the church.
And we now move into the old age of saying that oppressed people oppress people. And what do we mean by that in the context of the church? It means we have people that are part of the Christian faith that still are very much indoctrinated into whiteness, because the church in its essence is a white entity and it's always used to push forward white agendas. Again, oppressed people, and you can see this with the black on black crime that's happening in and around the churches. I went to the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, and I was there. I saw what was going on. I'm not going to talk about my experience because this is not my story to tell. This is a South African narrative around church and the Black person. But we are seeing a lot of that indoctrination around how to suppress people happen in and around the church.
In Black churches in South Africa, instances of abuse and oppression, including sexual harassment, rape, and gender-based violence, has been reported. There are strong cases of church leaders using their position to marginalize and further discriminate against its Black congregation.
These are a list of Black on Black crimes that we've seen. Pastor Mboro, Pastor Omotoso, Pastor Zondo, Bushiri, TB Joshua. Who's the guy that made people drink alcohol? That guy? Guy that made people eat grass? That guy? The snake guy? So this is not supposed to be funny, but what I'm trying to show you is Christianity Black on Black. And you can see it's from a power accession perspective. The pastors want to exert power into the congregation. And I'm not going to be like, oh, you blame, but you can read between the lines about what I'm trying to say to you guys.
A lot of the Black on Black crime perpetuated by the churches was mainly towards Black women. And I just wanted to quickly show here the connection of the abuse of the Black women, the church, and colonialism. Today, the church has a prominent role in the lives of many Black women. Thus, the church has an integral responsibility of pursuing liberation of Black women and ultimately all humanity. Nevertheless, the church cannot move towards liberation without critiquing the toxic relationship between church and coloniality and its legacy on the conquest of Black African women through patriarchal violence. Undoubtedly, many Black women continue to experience patriarchal violence to this day, and the church has many a time become the source of the suffering.
And you might ask yourself, so why do the Black people then continue to stay in these churches?
This article attempts to answer that question. Hundreds of fellow prophets operating in cities, townships, and shacks on the African continent and elsewhere in the world today are providing a supply to a veritable and powerful demand. More obviously, there is clearly a ripe codependent relationship between the followers and the leaders. This codependency is accentuated by poverty in South Africa, with 80% of South Africans having no medical aid, 25% of people being unemployed, and 2.5 million of young South Africans being out of work, as well as being aided by the failing public service and education system. The mix of poverty, the fear of slipping deeper and back into hardships, ignorance born out of little or no education. All these combine to produce the perfect context for a dangerous codependent relationship between the leaders and the followers. Swollen with power, authority, and all the symbols, a lot of the prophets believe that they are special and proceed to abuse their power. In the eyes of their followers, the only way out of this forest is with miracles.
So the people that become pastors nowadays in these churches, these charismatic churches, actually are after power, and they know that they have a docile congregation that has already been indoctrinated into Christian slavery by the white ministries. So
I'm not going to get deeply into this topic, but I just wanted to touch on Black religious trauma and looking at the history and context of the contact of the Black person with the church comes from colonization via the missionaries and then via apartheid and then again via the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And as you witness Black people and their relationship with the church today, you can see its legacy through the power dynamics played out in the church.
So, what else do I want to say about this? Is there anything else I want to say? No. Again, to the original question around is Christianity the new slavery? I think you can answer that for yourself. And for me, my main aim with this essay was to show you the role that the Christian faith, the church, still plays up until this day in determining the state of Black people in South Africa and determining their future and their standard of living and how they live and experience themselves in South Africa. With that said, I don't think I have any more information to give to the masses. So do comment, do subscribe, and do tell your friends. Otherwise, thank you so much. See you next week.